Dude, this response from the White House spokesperson, but also just America's position right now. So with the bombing on the Kiev hospital, there were a lot of Ukrainians who thought maybe this could move the needle. And there's still some people who talk about this possibly being the first step to moving the needle. I don't know. It's impossible to say this early on. But they were saying that maybe this would move the needle on the United States because a KH-101 cruise missile, which is what was launched at Ukraine, cannot be fired from the ground. It has to be fired from an aircraft that takes off from a Russian airbase, which are located, you guessed it, in Russia. Now, currently, the United States government, as we talked about previously on this stream, has only allowed Western weapons, HIMARS, for example, to be used only across the border with Russia if that region is being used to send ground forces over the border. That means, for example, the Russian invasion into Kharkiv to take Volchansk, they're allowed to bomb them over the border because the Russians are trying to use that area to invade. Makes sense. Makes sense that if the Russians are using an area to attack Ukraine, then they have approval to use their weapons to strike them back in those areas. There's not much reason to hit a random target in Vladivostok with Western weapons. There's much more reason to hit the troops that are invading directly over your border with Western weapons. It's easy logic to understand. This logic was then logically extended. This logic was then logically extended to the Sumy Oblast because the Russians had a few small raids with Chechen units into the Sumy Oblast. Those Chechens got sniped, but they got to do a quick propaganda operation where they rose a flag, they all saluted it, they got sniped, and then they ran away. Now, because there is fear that the Russians might do an offensive on the Sumy Oblast, even though I hear that the government, at least the leadership of defenses around Sumy, is actually very competent, above the usual standard of competency when it comes to setting up these types of defenses. And so it might not be a smart move for the Russians, period. It might be a diversionary tactic, but these raids gave enough indication that there was a risk in the buildup of troops on the border with Sumy, at least some troops produced enough of a risk that instead of waiting for the Russians to just cross the border with all their troops like they did in Volchansk when Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was warning about it like a month beforehand, they gave them approval to strike across the border. So that logic was logically extended into Sumy because if you want to defend the Kharkiv Oblast, if you want to defend the border, then you defend all the border. So the logic continued. It logically extended. I was like, great. The Biden administration, this is a consistent policy. It is a logical policy. It disincentivizes them attacking Sumy. It disincentivizes them attacking other regions who could then be quickly approved to also be struck. It would just, oh gosh, this is logical policy making. Good. Great. So the policy made sense. But if the logic is Ukraine has the right to hit targets that are attacking Ukraine from across the border because Russia is using that area to attack them, they're using the political divide of their border to try to protect them from these responses to their attacks when they're the one escalating, they're the one expanding the conflict. It made sense. It made sense in Kharkiv. It made sense in Sumy. But if they're allowed to do that, then shouldn't it logically extend to anywhere the Russians are attacking from? And not just ground targets, but air targets as well. If the Russians bomb their electrical grid from an air base in Kursk, or if the Russians bomb the, hospital of Ukrainian children in Kiev, why would the Ukrainians not have the permission to use said Western weapons, like, for example, an ATACMS, which can do devastating damage to Russian aircraft? I mean, when the first use of an ATACMS in Ukraine was against a group of Russian helicopters at an air base in southern Ukraine that almost immediately impacted the rate of Russian helicopter attacks on the southern counteroffensive. Those ATACMS expand above the target, drop a ton of tungsten balls all over the location, and a bunch of submunitions which do devastating damage over a large area. So you got a bunch of planes or a bunch of helicopters spread out over an airbase. You can do a lot of damage with a bunch of ATACMS. It's also faster, it's got decent range, and it's much more likely to hit the target than, say, a Ukrainian drone. So even though the Ukrainians have other weapons, and the American administration will point this out, saying they could use the other weapons, these weapons are going to be more likely to actually do the damage, get through, and end up hurting the Russian Air Force and making them pay for their attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and destroying the tools by which they do it. So a direct response, an unambiguous direct response for these attacks on things like civilian infrastructure, like healthcare infrastructure. So why does that logic not extend? I think it's a fear of escalation. It could be somebody like Jake Sullivan whispering in the ear of the president, even as other Western countries like France and others call for this policy to change. The Ukrainians have been calling for this policy to change for a while. This position is standing firm. It's just really hard to defend it as the Russians bomb another, and I am saying another, hospital in Ukraine. Listen to a member of the press corps question White House spokesperson John Kirby on the logic behind restricting them from striking the air bases from which Russia is bombing them.
Rocket attack that killed 30 people at the largest children's hospital. Does this shift the U.S.'s position on not allowing Ukraine to strike directly at Russian airfields that originated these attacks?
Shift the position?
Yeah, does this make you change your mind about not allowing that? And how do you justify not giving Ukraine permission to attack?
So there's two questions here. Number one, does this shift the position? And number two, how do you justify it? Notice which one he answers.
There's been no change in our policy. You saw that the president several weeks ago gave guidance to Ukraine that they can use U.S. supplied weapons to strike targets just over the border. That's still the case.
On Iran...
And he just didn't answer justification, because he can't really justify it. Because then he has to be in the position as to why you don't blow up the jets that are blowing up children's hospitals. Not a fun position to defend in public. So he just chose not to defend it at all. You know, I would say if Kamala came out and started making a few statements about changes she would make on foreign policy decisions, you know, maybe I'd be a lot quicker to say, you know, Joe, you are pretty old. I'm just saying. I am just saying. And you can't punish me for just saying. Did we stop Nazi Germany by only bombing military targets? Geneva Convention was also adopted. Wait, we're not even talking about bombing non-military targets. We don't need to bomb fucking Russian apartment blocks. We can, like, you target oil and gas infrastructure, the stuff that makes the war machine, like, financeable. You target the air bases from which they attack Ukraine, and you attack the logistics by which they support that war. There's no need to, like, let's make the Russians suffer. Like, their loss of men and material would be all the suffering that I think would be necessary, really. And plus, let me be clear, there's plenty of military targets to hit, as Zanef is talking about in chat, that you don't really need to, like, talk about wasting attackums on anything that's non-important for Ukraine's defense. That's what got me about Breaking Point's analysis of the Crimea beach bombing, is like, it assumed that the Ukrainians were just like playing willy-nilly with millions upon millions of dollars of equipment that is not guaranteed into the future, and they wouldn't want to use it instead to bomb an S-300 or say like an air base in Crimea, which is one of the few places where the Ukrainians are allowed to hit air bases because it's in Ukraine and not Russia. Occupied Ukraine is still Ukraine. If you like your Mariupol, you can keep it. That is a good quote. That is a fantastic quote. Okay.
Burns is an
immoral, morally corrupt, bankrupt man. Why, thank you.